For nearly 2 millennia, scholars have wrestled with 4 verses that seem deliberately cryptic. Genesis 6, 1-4 reads like a classified document with half the pages missing. Who were the sons of God? What were these giants that terrorized the ancient world? And why did the inspired author of Genesis provide so few details about an event catastrophic enough to trigger a global flood? The answers may lie in a book that was deliberately hidden from the Western Church for over 1,000 years. A book so controversial that early church fathers quoted it as scripture, but later theologians buried it in darkness. A book that provides names, details, and explanations for every mystery that Genesis leaves hanging. Today, we're going to investigate whether the Book of Enoch is the missing key to the greatest mystery in the Bible. Let's investigate this further. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds discovered something that would shake biblical scholarship to its foundations. Hidden in caves near the Dead Sea, archaeologists found fragments of nearly every book of the Old Testament. But they found something else, pieces of a book that had been lost to the Western world for over a millennium, the Book of Enoch. For centuries, scholars dismissed Enoch as a medieval forgery. After all, the only complete version survived in Ethiopia, written in an obscure language called Ge'ez. How could we trust a book that seemed to emerge from nowhere? But the Dead Sea Scrolls changed everything. Carbon dating proved that Enoch existed in the 3rd century before Christ, before Jesus was born, before the New Testament was written, before Christianity even existed. This wasn't a later fabrication. It was ancient Jewish literature that Second Temple Judaism treasured. Here's where it gets interesting. When you examine the early church fathers, Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Athenagoras, they didn't just know about Enoch. They quoted it as authoritative scripture. Jude, the brother of Jesus, cited Enoch by name. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church still includes it in their Bible. So what happened? Why did the Western Church bury this book? The answer isn't theological, it's political. When Christianity became the official religion of Rome, church leaders grew uncomfortable with Enoch's vivid descriptions of fallen angels having sex with human women. It seemed too scandalous, too mythological for respectable theology. They had a choice. Interpret Genesis 6 supernaturally with the help of Enoch, or find a more rational explanation. They chose rationalization. And in doing so, they may have thrown away the key to understanding the most mysterious passage in Scripture. But here's the crucial question. What if the reason Genesis 6 seems incomplete isn't because information was lost, but because ancient readers already had the full story? What if Moses wrote those 4 cryptic verses, assuming his audience would fill in the blanks from sources they knew by heart? Look closer at this detail. Moses wrote 50 chapters about building a tent, but only 4 verses about an event that destroyed civilization? That's not accidental. That's editorial choice. Genesis 6, 1-4 isn't a complete account. It's a summary, a reference point. Ancient writers did this constantly. They assumed their readers possessed background knowledge from oral tradition, other texts, and cultural memory. Think about it. If you were writing about World War II today, you might simply write, "After Pearl Harbor, America entered the war." You wouldn't need to explain who attacked Pearl Harbor, why it mattered, or what happened next. Your audience already knows. That's exactly what's happening in Genesis 6. Moses is referencing an event his readers understood in detail. The question is, where did that detail come from? Traditional Jewish sources provide part of the answer. The Talmud, Midrash, and other rabbinic writings elaborate on the sons of God narrative. But these sources, compiled centuries after Moses, often contradict each other and lack the coherent framework needed to make sense of the story. Enoch is different. Written before most of these traditions crystallized, Enoch presents a unified, detailed account that explains every element Moses mentions. The identity of the sons of God, the nature of the Nephilim, the rapid spread of corruption, and the necessity of divine judgment. More importantly, Enoch's account aligns perfectly with how other biblical authors understood Genesis 6. When Jude writes about angels who did not keep their positions of authority but abandoned their proper dwelling, he's not inventing new theology. He's referencing the Enoch tradition that explains Genesis. When Peter mentions spirits in prison who disobeyed long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, he's drawing from the same source. This isn't speculation. These are direct textual connections that suggest the apostles viewed Enoch not as mythology, but as the historical context for Genesis 6. But here's where the mystery deepens. Those 4 verses in Genesis contain 3 terms that have sparked centuries of theological debate. And every one of those debates dissolves when you read them through the lens of Enoch. The evidence points to something unexpected. Every other time the exact phrase B'nai Elohim appears in Scripture, it refers to angels, not humans, angels. In Job 1:6, the sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and Satan is among them. In Job 2:1, the same scene repeats. In Job 38:7, the sons of God shout for joy when God lays the foundations of the earth. In every instance, the context is clearly heavenly beings in God's divine counsel. But here's what most people miss. The Hebrew language has different constructions for different relationships to God. When humans are called God's children, the text typically uses B'nai Israel, children of Israel, or B'nai Elohim, children of God. The phrase B'nai Elohim is reserved for direct divine offspring, angels. The Septuagint translators, working just 2 centuries before Christ, understood this distinction. They translated B'nai Elohim as angeloi tou theou, angels of God. These weren't later Christians imposing supernatural interpretations. These were Jewish scholars translating for Jewish audiences who understood the original intent. This raises an intriguing question. If the early church unanimously interpreted this passage as referring to fallen angels, when did that change? The answer is shocking. Not until the 5th century. For the first 4 centuries of Christianity, virtually every church father who addressed Genesis 6 understood it as describing fallen angels. Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Athenagoras, all taught the angelic interpretation. The shift began with Julius Africanus around 220 AD and was solidified by Augustine around 400 AD. Their motivation wasn't new exegetical insight. It was discomfort with the sexual implications of the text. Augustine argued that because Jesus said angels don't marry in the resurrection, they couldn't have married in Genesis 6. But this reasoning contains a logical flaw. Jesus was describing the glorified state of angels in God's kingdom, not their capabilities when they rebel against God. It's like arguing that because priests take vows of celibacy, fallen priests never commit sexual sins. The Sethite theory, that the sons of God were descendants of Seth marrying descendants of Cain, was a theological compromise designed to remove supernatural elements from the text. But it creates more problems than it solves. And this is where scholars disagree most dramatically. Because the Sethite theory cannot explain what happened next. What do you notice here? Numbers 13:33 mentions Nephilim descendants living in Canaan. But didn't the flood destroy everyone except Noah's family? This is the Nephilim paradox that has puzzled commentators for millennia. If the Nephilim were simply large humans born from intermarriage between Seth's line and Cain's line, how did they survive a global flood? More importantly, why would their offspring be consistently described as giants? Standard human genetics doesn't produce consistent gigantism across generations. Yet biblical descriptions suggest the post-flood Anakim, Rephaim, and other giant clans maintained their extraordinary size over centuries. Enoch provides a solution that mainstream theology has avoided: a second incursion. According to Enoch's detailed chronology, the initial rebellion of 200 Watchers occurred in the days of Jared. These fallen angels taught forbidden knowledge and produced the first generation of Nephilim, giants so large and voracious they consumed all human agriculture, then turned to cannibalism, and finally began devouring each other. The flood destroyed these hybrids, but it didn't destroy all the fallen angels. Enoch describes multiple ranks of Watchers, with only the initial 200 being immediately bound. The implication is that other fallen angels continued their interference with human genetics after the flood. This explains several otherwise puzzling biblical patterns. First, it explains Israel's holy war commands in Canaan. God's instructions to completely destroy certain peoples weren't ethnic cleansing, they were genetic quarantine. These weren't ordinary human tribes. They were populations corrupted by ongoing fallen angel interference. Second, it explains the consistent descriptions of giant warriors throughout Old Testament history. Goliath wasn't an anomaly. He was part of a continuing supernatural problem. Third, it explains why biblical authors treat encounters with giants as spiritual warfare, not merely military conflict. David's victory over Goliath wasn't just human courage overcoming human opposition. It was divine power defeating demonic corruption. Archaeological evidence supports unusually large skeletal remains in the ancient Near East, though mainstream academia typically attributes these to rare medical conditions or measurement errors. But Enoch suggests something more systematic: ongoing fallen angel attempts to corrupt human genetics and prevent the coming of the Messiah through Abraham's line. The investigation continues, but if Enoch's framework seems too supernatural, consider this. It's the only explanation that makes sense of the rapid corruption described in Genesis 6. Here's what most people miss when reading Genesis 6. The corruption wasn't just moral, it was technological. Verse 11 says the earth was filled with violence. But the Hebrew word Hamas doesn't just mean personal aggression. It means systemic injustice, organized oppression, the kind of violence that requires advanced weapons and social structures. How did humanity develop such sophisticated corruption so quickly? Genesis 4 shows early civilization: farming, herding, basic metalworking. By Genesis 6, society had become so advanced in evil that God regretted creating humanity at all. Enoch fills in the missing timeline. According to Enoch's detailed account, the 200 fallen Watchers didn't just interbreed with humans, they revolutionized human civilization by teaching forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught metallurgy and weapons manufacturing, how to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. Before this, humans had bronze farming tools. After this, they had arsenals capable of systematic warfare. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, what we might call pharmacology and sorcery. The ability to alter consciousness, control minds, and manipulate spiritual forces. Other Watchers taught astronomy that became astrology, not scientific observation, but attempts to control fate through cosmic manipulation. They taught cosmetics and jewelry making that became tools of deception and seduction. They taught mining and gem cutting that enabled accumulation of vast wealth. Most significantly, they taught writing and literacy, but not for education, for the preservation and dissemination of forbidden arts. What do you see emerging? A technological revolution driven by supernatural intelligence, advancing human capabilities far beyond their spiritual maturity to handle those capabilities. This isn't ancient mythology. This is a warning about technology without wisdom, power without restraint, knowledge without moral development. Modern parallels are sobering. Nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, advanced surveillance, social media manipulation. Every technological breakthrough brings potential for unprecedented good or unprecedented evil. Enoch suggests this isn't coincidental. It suggests there are spiritual forces deliberately pushing technological development faster than ethical development, creating tools that can be used for massive human destruction. The difference is that in Noah's day, humanity wasn't ready to resist. They were spiritually naive, easily impressed by supernatural demonstrations, willing to trade moral restraint for technological power. The result was a civilization so corrupted that God had to start over. But the investigation isn't complete. If Enoch was just ancient mythology, why did New Testament authors treat it as historical fact?
What we find here is remarkable. Jude doesn't just reference Enoch, he quotes it verbatim. Jude 14-15 contains a direct citation from 1 Enoch 1:9. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming, with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones, to judge everyone, and to convict all of them of all the ungodly acts they have committed in their ungodliness, and of all the defiant words ungodly sinners have spoken against him. When you compare this with the Ethiopian text of Enoch discovered at Qumran, the correspondence is nearly word for word. Jude isn't paraphrasing or alluding, he's making a formal citation of written scripture. But that's just the beginning. The entire framework of spiritual warfare in the New Testament depends on concepts that Enoch developed, but Genesis only hints at. 2 Peter 2:4 mentions God casting angels into Tartarus, a Greek term for the deepest prison of the underworld. This concept doesn't exist in the Old Testament, but it perfectly matches Enoch's description of the Watchers being bound in Dudail, a dark prison beneath jagged rocks until the final judgment. 1 Peter 3:19-20 describes Christ preaching to spirits in prison who disobeyed long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah. Again, this refers directly to the Enochian narrative of bound watchers awaiting their final sentence. Jude 6 mentions angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, being kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. This language is so specific to Enoch's account that it's impossible to explain without direct literary dependence. Revelation 9:11 names the angel of the abyss as Abaddon in Hebrew and Apollyon in Greek, names that trace back to Enochian angelology. Even Jesus' favorite self-designation, Son of Man, reaches its fullest development in the parables of Enoch, where a pre-existent heavenly figure bears this title and exercises universal judgment. The evidence speaks for itself. The New Testament authors didn't view Enoch as mythology or pseudepigraphic fiction. They treated it as the authoritative historical background for understanding Genesis 6 and its ongoing spiritual implications. This wasn't cultural accommodation or literary borrowing. This was apostolic endorsement of Enoch's theological framework. The question isn't whether Enoch influenced the New Testament. The question is why we've forgotten what the apostles remembered. And then they understood. The answer had been there all along. Enoch wasn't contradicting Scripture. It was providing the missing manual, the detailed technical specifications for a cosmic conflict that Genesis summarized in 4 verses. The early church possessed this understanding. They read Genesis 6 with Enochian eyes, seeing not primitive mythology, but sophisticated theology about the intersection of spiritual and physical realms. They understood that the Nephilim weren't just big people. They were hybrids, creatures that represented Satan's attempt to corrupt the human bloodline and prevent the coming of the Messiah. They understood that the rapid spread of violence before the flood wasn't random human wickedness. It was the result of fallen angels systematically corrupting human civilization with forbidden knowledge and genetic interference. They understood that the flood wasn't divine overreaction. It was necessary surgery, the only way to remove a spiritual cancer that threatened to destroy the image of God in humanity entirely. They understood that the giants Israel faced in Canaan weren't merely military challenges. They were manifestations of the same spiritual warfare that had triggered the flood.
ongoing attempts to establish beachheads of supernatural corruption in the Promised Land. Most importantly, they understood that this wasn't ancient history. It was the continuing context for the cosmic war between light and darkness, the reason why spiritual warfare remains real and necessary. But somewhere between the apostolic age and the medieval period, the Western Church lost this framework. Uncomfortable with the supernatural implications, theologians gradually replaced Enoch's cosmic perspective with rationalized alternatives. The result was a sanitized Christianity that could explain individual sin, but not systemic evil. Personal salvation, but not cosmic warfare. Human responsibility, but not spiritual manipulation. What they discovered wasn't just historical curiosity. It was a window into the invisible war that still rages around us. A war where technology, knowledge, and power become weapons in hands that shouldn't wield them. Enoch's warning echoes across millennia. When spiritual forces offer forbidden knowledge to bypass God's moral order, the result is always civilizational collapse. The only question is whether we're wise enough to recognize the pattern before it's too late.
Tonight, when you read Genesis 6, remember, you're not reading mythology. You're reading a battlefield report from the war between heaven and earth. The Watchers who taught forbidden metallurgy. The Nephilim who consumed everything in their path. The corruption that grew so complete, God had to start civilization over. These weren't fairy tales. They were warnings about what happens when spiritual forces seduce humanity with promises of knowledge and power that come without wisdom and restraint. About what happens when technology advances faster than morality. About what happens when we forget that some boundaries exist for our protection, not God's convenience. What we know is remarkable. What we don't know might be even more so. The ancient world was far more supernatural and far more dangerous than we ever imagined. But it was also far more protected than we realize. Because the same God who judged the Watchers is still watching over us. Have you ever wondered why certain biblical passages seem deliberately vague? What other missing pieces might be hiding in plain sight? Share your thoughts in the comments. You might be the key someone else needs to unlock their own biblical mystery.